The war began, as most wars do, with optimism. Young men believed they were marching off to defend the world, to fight tyranny and return home as heroes. One of them was Horace Greeley, a 20-year-old hairdresser from Leicestershire, England. He wasn't born a soldier. He didn't crave glory. He simply wanted to do what was right. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, Horace enlisted in the Leicestershire Regiment, along with his best friend Ron. They trained under the cold English rain, drilling with old rifles and borrowed resolve. By May 1940, his unit was deployed to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force. The talk among the men was that the war would be over by Christmas. But within weeks, everything collapsed. The German blitzkrieg hit like a storm. Tanks tore through the Ardennes. Stukas screamed from the skies. Horace and his unit were cut off near Lille, surrounded by advancing German divisions. For days, they fought and retreated, sleeping in ditches, scavenging food, the sound of artillery never far. When they finally ran out of ammunition, there was nothing left to do but surrender. The memory of that moment would stay with him forever. The German officer shouting in harsh English, the cold barrel of a rifle against his back, the line of exhausted British soldiers forced to march east toward Germany. The journey to the camp was a nightmare. Hundreds of prisoners were herded like cattle through ruined towns and rain-soaked fields. Some collapsed and were left behind. Others were shot where they fell. Horace walked for 10 days, his boots worn through, his stomach empty. At one point, a German soldier shoved him for lagging behind. Horace stared back but said nothing. When they finally reached their destination, a camp of barbed wire and wooden huts in Poland, he realized the war he had imagined was over. What began next was a war of endurance. The camp was officially known as Stalag 8B, near Lambsdorff. To the men inside, it was simply hell with fences. Barbed wire surrounded every inch of it. Guard towers loomed overhead, manned by sentries with machine guns. Inside, men slept 6 to a bunk, in huts crawling with lice. Food was watery soup and a crust of bread. But worse than hunger was the boredom, the slow, suffocating crawl of days that never changed. That's what broke most men. Not torture, not beatings, just time. But not Horace Greeley. From the start, he refused to be broken. He studied the guards, their routines, their weaknesses. He learned how they rotated shifts, when they smoked, when they drank. And he began to dream of freedom. His first attempt came within months. Using wire cutters stolen from the maintenance shed, Horace and 2 others slipped through the perimeter fence one foggy night. They ran for hours through the woods, the sound of dogs barking behind them. But they didn't know where they were, and before dawn, they were caught by a German patrol. They were beaten and locked in solitary confinement for a week. When the guards finally released him, a German officer sneered and said in broken English, "You try again, you die." Horace stared straight back and replied, "Then I'd better make it count." Days turned into months. New prisoners arrived. British, Polish, French, bringing stories from the front. Outside the fences, the world burned. Inside, Horace found an unlikely distraction. Her name was Rosa Rauchbach, a 17-year-old translator, half German, half Jewish. She worked for the camp's commandant, helping translate prisoner documents and medical reports. One day, Horace was called to the infirmary for a work detail. That's when he saw her. Dark hair tied back, eyes sharp and kind, a small silver cross around her neck. When she spoke, her voice was soft, accented. "You're English?" she asked. "Leicestershire," he said. "You?" "Germany," she replied. "But not by choice. That conversation changed everything. Over the following weeks, they found ways to meet in secret, near the camp fence, under the cover of darkness. Sometimes, she smuggled him extra food or bandages. Sometimes, they just talked. About freedom, about home, about everything they'd lost. In a place where life was stripped of hope, she gave him a reason to keep fighting. And soon, she became the reason for every escape that followed. Winter had settled over Poland like a shroud. Snow piled high along the fences of Stalag 8B, muffling every sound except the distant bark of guard dogs and the echo of boots on frozen earth. Inside Hut 13, Horace Greasley sat hunched over a tin cup of thin soup, staring at the frost forming on the window. The cold bit through the wooden walls, but it wasn't the cold that kept him awake. It was the thought of Rosa. Each day, he saw her briefly through the wire as she passed by the offices, her dark coat brushing the snow, her scarf tucked neatly around her neck. She would glance his way, sometimes for a heartbeat, sometimes longer, and that was enough. It wasn't supposed to happen. A prisoner and a German translator. But in that camp of gray uniforms and gray skies, their secret became a rebellion of its own. In early 1941, Horace tried again. He and 3 other prisoners had been assigned to a work party outside the camp, repairing roads for the German army. It was dangerous but offered opportunity. The guards were lazy that day, more interested in the food truck that had just arrived than in counting heads. As the Imagichi unloaded gravel, Horace whispered, "When the truck starts up, we go. Stay low. Keep to the ditch." The engine roared to life. Mud splashed, shouts rose, and Horace ran. He dove into the woods, branches whipping his face. Behind him came the sound of whistles and dogs. Bullets cracked through the trees. He ran until his lungs burned, then waded into a half-frozen stream to throw off the dog's scent. Hours later, he found shelter in a barn, collapsing into the hay. For 2 days he hid there, surviving on raw potatoes and melted snow. But without a compass or map, there was no escape route, only endless winter fields. By the 3rd night, he heard voices outside. German patrols. He was captured again. When the guards dragged him back, the camp commandant looked at him with amusement rather than anger. 500 kilometers from home, he said. And still you run. Why? Horace replied quietly. Because one day, I won't come back. He was beaten, thrown into solitary again, but he didn't care. The pain was nothing compared to the satisfaction of knowing he'd tried, and would again. Spring brought new work details and new chances. Horace had grown thinner, harder, his hair now streaked with dust and ash. The guards underestimated him. A mistake they would repeat again and again. Assigned to carry lumber for the camp's expansion, he noticed a weakness. One of the new fences was incomplete, the barbed wire not yet joined at the bottom. That night, as the guards changed shifts, he crawled under the loose section. His jacket snagged, the wire tore through his sleeve, but he didn't stop. Beyond the fence lay forest, freedom. He traveled by night, hiding by day, following the stars westward. At one farmhouse, an old Polish woman gave him bread and pointed the way toward the railway. But before he could reach it, he heard German voices again. He dove into a ditch, pressing his face into the mud as boots stomped past. He waited an hour before moving, but one wrong step snapped a twig and the shouting began again. Another chase, another capture. When they brought him back, even the guards seemed impressed. One whispered to another, "He must be mad." But Horace only smiled through split lips and said, "Mad, maybe, but not beaten." By now, Rosa knew of his attempts. They met one night near the wire fence, the moon high and cold above them. She whispered urgently, "You must stop. They'll kill you next time." "Then I'll die trying," he said. She stared at him through the darkness, her breath trembling. "Why do you keep doing this?" "Because I promised you. When I get out, I'll find you." For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the wind rustled through the wire. Then she pressed her hand against the fence, and he pressed his against hers, the metal cold between them. That night, she gave him a small token, a silver cross from around her neck. "For luck," she said. He kissed it and whispered, "For you." A week later, he tried again. This time, the escape was almost perfect. He hid in the back of a supply truck loaded with wood, slipping in as the guards argued over paperwork. The truck rumbled through the gate and onto the open road. Horace stayed silent, heart pounding, until the vehicle stopped hours later at a depot. He waited until dusk, then climbed out and began walking. He reached a nearby village and found a shed to sleep in. But luck doesn't last long in war. The next morning, a local collaborator spotted him and reported it. German soldiers arrived before he could run, back to the camp again. By 1943, Horace had escaped 4 times and been caught 4 times, but he hadn't given up. If anything, the failures had only sharpened his resolve, and then came his most daring attempt of all. It was summer. The guards were distracted by reports of Allied bombings. Horace and 2 others dug under the outer fence using spoons stolen from the kitchen. They tunneled for 3 nights. On the 4th, they broke through. He crawled through mud and darkness, the tunnel barely wide enough to breathe. When he emerged, the air was cool and the stars bright. He didn't stop. He ran until dawn. For days he made his way through villages, sleeping in barns, scavenging what food he could. He made it nearly 80 kilometers before the Germans caught him again, this time in a forest near Breslau. The guards laughed when they saw him. One said, "You again? You must love our camp." Horace grinned through the mud and replied, "Not half as much as I love leaving it." They beat him again, locked him up again, but his spirit never broke. The legend of the Englishman who wouldn't stay captured spread through the camp. Even the guards began calling him the Phantom. Rosa heard it too. And every time she saw him afterward, she smiled sadly and whispered, "My mad Englishman." By 1943, Stalag 8B had become a world within a world, a bleak fortress of wire, watchtowers, and weary men waiting for a war that felt endless. For many, the routine had become survival. Wake, count, labor, sleep, repeat. But for Horace Greasley, the camp had become something else entirely. The place where love had somehow survived war. He no longer dreamed of England or home. He dreamed of Rosa. She was still working for the German commandant, translating prisoner reports and Red Cross letters. Her face was calm when the officers were near, but her eyes always searched for him across the yard. They found ways to meet, impossibly, dangerously. At night, when the guards changed shifts, Rosa would slip from the office and make her way toward the perimeter fence. Horace would be waiting on the other side, crouched low in the dark, a shadow among shadows. They would talk in whispers through the wire, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, sharing bread, secrets, and dreams that the war had tried to steal. One night, she whispered through tears, "You'll die if you keep escaping." He smiled faintly. "I'll die if I stop." Then she reached through the wire, her hand trembling, and he took it in his own. The touch lasted only a moment before the spotlight swept past, and they vanished into the darkness once more. Though official records mark 5 escapes, the truth was far more daring. In his later memoirs, Horace revealed that he escaped the camp over 200 times. Not to run away, but to meet Rosa. Each journey was a miracle of timing and nerve. He would slice, pee under the wire or through a hole in the fence after roll call, crossing miles of farmland to a nearby village where Rosa was housed by the German administration. He'd climb through her window, mud-covered, exhausted and grinning. She would scold him softly, clean his wounds, and make him food, bread, cheese, sometimes even a glass of milk. They would spend an hour together, sometimes two, and before dawn he'd sneak back into camp, slipping through the wire before roll call began. It was madness. It was love. And it worked. For almost 2 years. The guards began to notice strange footprints near the fence. One morning, a patrol found a single British boot print in the mud outside the wire. The commandant was furious. He ordered a full search, dogs, inspections, tighter schedules. But Horace always stayed one step ahead. The men in his hut knew what he was doing, but none betrayed him. They saw in his eyes something they'd lost, a reason to keep living. One prisoner, a Scotsman named Baker, once told him, "You're mad, Greasley, madder than any of us. But when you crawl out that wire, it's like we all escape for a while." Even Rosa's German colleagues began to suspect. One day, an SS officer noticed her leaving the office after hours. He questioned her the next morning, his tone sharp. "Where were you last night?" She lied without flinching. "I was delivering reports to the commandant's aide." He watched her closely, but said nothing more. Every night after that, she risked her life for those brief stolen hours, for the man beyond the fence. In early 1944, the situation worsened. Allied bombings grew heavier. The Germans grew desperate, and punishments for prisoners became more severe. When Horace learned that Rosa might be transferred to another district, he decided to do the unthinkable, help her escape too. He began planning, bribing a guard with cigarettes and chocolate from Red Cross parcels. The idea was simple. She would slip away during a work transport, meet him at a farmhouse outside the camp, and they'd head west. But fate is cruel in war. The night before their plan, the camp was placed on lockdown. A Polish prisoner had escaped and been shot. The guards doubled their patrols, their dogs restless and hungry. Horace tried to get a message to Rosa, but it was too late. She never came that night. The next morning, she didn't appear in the office either. When he asked quietly through another translator, the man whispered, "She's gone. They took her away, maybe to Germany." Horace froze. The world went silent. He spent hours by the fence that night, waiting, hoping, whispering her name into the wind. But there was no answer. Days turned into weeks. He kept searching for news, asking new guards, new prisoners, anyone who might have heard of a young woman taken from Lambsdorff. Nothing. But he refused to believe she was dead. To the men in his hut, he said, "If she's alive, I'll find her. If she's gone, I'll make sure they remember what she stood for." And so he began again, escaping, not for love this time, but for revenge. He led work parties that sabotaged equipment, cut wires, and damaged roads. Each act of defiance was a tribute to her. In the final year of the war, Horace Greasley became a legend among prisoners, the man who escaped a Nazi camp not once, not twice, but every time love called, and every time he came back. Tone, emotional, realistic, and cinematic, told with the weight of his story and the heart of survival. By the winter of 1944, the German Reich was dying, though no one inside Stalag Veit B could yet see it. The guards were still brutal, the fences still electrified, and the rations smaller than ever. But there was something different in the air, a kind of nervousness among the Germans, a fear that hadn't been there before. Rumors spread through the camp like wildfire. The Allies had landed in France. Paris had been liberated. The Red Army was advancing from the east. Freedom, after 5 years, felt closer than ever. Horace Greasley listened to the whispers each night as he lay on his bunk. The men around him spoke of home, of wives, mothers, children they hadn't seen since the war began. But for Horace, home wasn't in England anymore. It had been a girl with dark hair, standing by a fence in the snow. He still kept her silver cross hidden beneath his shirt. Every morning, before roll call, he would touch it. A ritual, a promise. "For you, Rosa," he whispered. "For both of us." The camp had changed. The guards, once arrogant and cruel, now looked thinner, quieter. Their uniforms were worn, their boots unpolished. The war had reached them too. By January 1945, the rumble of artillery could be heard in the distance. The Soviets were coming. The Germans panicked. They began evacuating the camp, forcing thousands of POWs to march west in the freezing cold. It would become known later as the Long March, one of the darkest ordeals of the war. Horace was among them. He marched through snow and mud, his thin boots soaked, his body weak with hunger. Every few miles a man would collapse, never to rise again. The guards shouted and fired into the air, desperate to keep control. Horace kept moving, driven not by orders but by sheer will. At night, when the column stopped, he scavenged what he could. A crust of bread, a sip of melted snow. He tore strips of cloth from his jacket to bind his bleeding feet. But even then, even in that frozen hell, he thought of Rosa. He imagined her somewhere in the chaos of Germany, alive, waiting. That thought kept him alive. After weeks on the road, they reached another camp, Stalag 70A, near Moosburg, in Bavaria. It was overcrowded, filthy, a sea of ragged men and hopeless faces. But it was also weaker. The guards no longer cared to check every fence, every tunnel, every shadow. And Horace saw opportunity again. It was February 1945. The front lines were closing in fast. The air raids came daily, the sky rumbling with Allied bombers. Horace gathered 2 other prisoners, a Scotsman named Baker and a Canadian sergeant named Harris. Together, they planned one last escape. Under cover of night, they crawled through a drainage ditch that led beneath the fence. The mud was freezing, the stench unbearable, but freedom was on the other side. When they emerged, they ran. Across open fields, through smoke and falling snow, toward the sound of artillery in the distance. They followed the glow of burning towns, staying off roads, hiding by day. For 5 nights, they crept through Bavaria, surviving on scraps. On the 6th day, they heard shouting, not German, but English. Voices. They pushed through the brush and found themselves staring at a convoy of American tanks. A soldier raised his rifle, then lowered it when he saw their uniforms. "Holy hell," the American said. "You boys are ghosts." Horace smiled weakly. Not yet. They were free. He was taken to a field hospital, half-starved, barely able to stand. When asked his name, he could barely speak. Private Horace Greasley, Leicestershire Regiment. It was the first time in years he'd said his full name aloud. In the days that followed, he began to recover. The Americans gave him food, clean clothes, cigarettes. But while the other men spoke of going home, Horace asked only one question. "Has anyone seen a girl named Rosa Rauschbach?" No one had. He kept asking, to officers, to translators, to anyone who might know. But the answer was always the same. Silence. The war had swallowed millions of lives. One name meant nothing to the world, but it meant everything to him. When the war officially ended in May 1945, Horace returned to England. His hometown was quiet, rebuilt, and indifferent to the chaos that had torn Europe apart. He was offered medals and honors, but he declined them all. He told a friend, "I didn't fight for medals. I fought to live, and for someone who made me want to." Years passed. He built a new life, opened a barbershop, married, raised a family. But he never forgot Rosa. Every night, he'd sit by his window, silver cross in hand, and wonder if she'd survived. If somewhere, she still remembered the mad Englishman who'd crossed fences for her. He never found her again. When Horace Greeley returned home in 1945, England was already moving on. The streets buzzed with victory parades, bunting hung from rooftops, and people danced in celebration of peace. But for Horace, the war wasn't over. It lived on behind his eyes, in memories of barbed wire, hunger, and a girl who had vanished into the storm. He walked the cobbled streets of Leicestershire that first morning home. His uniform faded, his boots cracked from years of marching. No one recognized him at first. 5 years in a German camp had aged him beyond his 26 years. When he stepped into his family's house, his mother gasped, dropped the teacup she was holding, and ran to him. "You're home," she whispered. "I told you I would be," he said softly. But even as he smiled, he touched the small silver cross still hanging around his neck. In the months that followed, Horace tried to return to normal life. He opened a small barbershop in the village, trimming hair, listening to people talk about the war, as if it had been a film they'd all seen once. Sometimes he'd smile and nod. Other times he'd grow quiet, staring at the mirror behind them, seeing not their reflections, but the fence, the snow, and Rosa's face. He rarely spoke of her, but those who knew him said he carried her memory like a wound that never healed. The world slowly learned about men who had escaped Nazi camps, daring stories of tunnels, disguises, and lucky breaks. But none were quite like Horace Greeley's. He hadn't escaped to run away. He'd escaped to return. Again and again. When fellow veterans asked him why, he'd simply say, "Because there was something outside the fence worth dying for." In 2008, more than 60 years after the war ended, Horace's story finally came to light. A biographer named Ken Scott published his memoirs, titled, "Do the Birds Still Sing in Hell? The Extraordinary True Tale of T.U., a young English soldier who escaped a Nazi camp 5 times, and over 200 times unofficially, just to see the woman he loved." The world was stunned. Newspapers called him the most romantic prisoner of war in history. Television hosts called him a hero. But when reporters asked Horace how he wanted to be remembered, he just chuckled and said, "I was just stubborn. I didn't like fences." The book became a sensation. Readers around the world were moved by the love story that had survived the war's darkest days. People sent him letters, soldiers, widows, even children, thanking him for reminding them that love can exist even in hell. He replied to as many as he could, often signing with a small sketch of a heart and the initials H+R. When asked once if he ever found Rosa again, he shook his head and said quietly, "No, but I hope she knew I tried." In his later years, Horace lived a quiet life near Hinckley. He enjoyed gardening, chess, and the company of old friends. He would tell war stories in the local pub, his voice steady, his humor intact. And every now and then, when the conversation turned to courage, he'd raise his glass and say, "Courage isn't what you do when you're told. It's what you do when your heart won't let you stop." On February 4th, 2010, at the age of 91, Horace Greeley passed away peacefully in his sleep. On his bedside table lay 2 things: a photograph of his family and a small tarnished silver cross. When the local paper printed his obituary, it read, "He escaped 5 times, but love was the one thing he never escaped from." Today, in the archives of war museums and history books, his name stands as a quiet testament to resilience and devotion. There were thousands of prisoners who suffered in camps like Stalag 8B, but few who defied the wire with such audacity. and none who did it for love. When historians revisit his file, they see the same record over and over. Captured, escaped, recaptured, escaped again. But between those lines lies something deeper. A story that no paper could record. A story of a young man who refused to surrender his heart to war. Freedom isn't just leaving the camp, Horace once said. It's finding something the enemy can't take away. And in that, he was truly free.